Thanks to all the participants. Good evening. This is Sunil here, and thanks for investing the last hour of the working week today for most of us. So we'll keep this very succinct and crisp, considering we are over the weekend. And with that said, we'll get on to the ground rules of this topic currently, which we're going to deal with. Firstly, all your audios and videos will be on mute, and you'll have a question answer session at the end of the topic, which you could please post your questions, based on which we'll answer each of them to an extent we can. The session is planned for 40-45 minutes, with around last 10 minutes to be on Q&A. The webinar will be recorded, and the topic which we're dealing today, I'll get into the topic now, which is on the internal controls in the pandemic scenario. This is something which we've deliberated, and then on behalf of the panel, we've just discussed that, this is something which all of us in the past 10 weeks have been going through. The control framework changes, there's so many changes which have happened over the past 10 weeks. With that said, what we try to do here differently is to deliberate on what could be the practical scenarios and have discussions on the illustrations. So you would see here in the next 40 minutes, each of these 8-10 cases which we have taken up, which we'll be discussing now, more from a practical scenario, which could be applicable to most of us, or maybe for some in certain sectors, as we have taken examples, and we will share that with you. It's almost impossible to cover all these topics in an hour's time, so we've just picked up certain key aspects as illustrations. With that said, as we continue to exist in this pandemic scenario and grow, governance or continued governance cannot be compromised at all. I think all of us are completely aware that the timelines, deadlines, regulatory requirements, and all have to be met. All we need to do as a control assurance group, or as a set of people who are working in this phase, we will have to ensure that the boards get the assurance, either we are on a remote working mode through various adaptations and amendments we do, and ensure that we mitigate the upcoming and the new risks which have been surfaced in the past few times or past few weeks, and then accordingly address it. That gets me to the first half, which will be dealt by Lakshman, my co-speaker. Lakshman is from Grant Thornton, Hyderabad office, and he's got 2 decades of experience, and he's been dealing in the controls and the risk space for nearing 2 decades. With that said, Lakshman, I'll be handing it over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Sunil. Good evening, everyone, and welcome for the IAA Hyderabad chapter's initiative on the webinar related to internal controls during pandemic scenario. The whole objective of this webcast is to highlight the implications, both short-term as well as long-term, of COVID-19 on the internal controls as such. Having said that, we would also focus on the need and assessment to adjust the control documentation, as well as what could be the adoptable approaches to help various organizations deal with the current situation, that is COVID-19. While we identified certain practical considerations or the key focus areas, we are sure there could be a lot of other considerations or areas as well that one might have come across. So as Sunil rightly said a while back, these are only a few examples that we are sharing based on our experience till date. And then we would like to take upon each of the topics going forward. And also the idea is not to give assurance or a solution, but the objective is to share our thoughts, our experiences with the larger group, and also seek your thoughts and responses in terms of the key focus areas. So moving on to the first focus area today, which is risk assessment. As most of us know, COVID-19 is resulting in significant operational disruption and also presents a threat of existence itself to a lot of businesses. While most of the companies do have the risk assessment process aligned in place, there is a need to elaborate on the existing reported risks, number one, and also, to determine how did they identify and assess the significance of so-called emerging or new business risks? For example, with the new normal, most of us are hearing terms such as social distancing in workplace, in office spaces as well as elsewhere, employee health and safety, and work from home or work from anywhere as the key areas that would be really significant going forward. Considering these three areas, it will be very significant for each of the organization to consider these as a part of the risk assessment framework going forward, and also identify the corresponding mitigating controls that are associated with these new emerging and business risks. On to the second point, also the discussion with those charged with governance as well as the management to, to understand the impact of COVID-19 has been completed, incorporated into the respective risk assessment processes would be really important. The reason here being the whole risk landscape is undergoing a significant change, which also includes certain strategic operational risks that are going to undergo a significant change as such. I'd like to quote an example here, like during the risk assessment phase, most of the organizations would have identified, say, geographical concentration or a vendor concentration risks as few key risks during the assessment process as such. Having said that, I'm sure, and based on our experience till date, most of the boards are now currently focusing on these two key aspects: geographical risk, concentration risk, succession planning, etc. So these are the various new topics and new emerging risks that needs to be discussed at various levels. For example, in case of an industry such as a pharma, wherein most of the raw materials are still being sourced from geographical location like China, where we most of us know, which is the hotbed of COVID-19. Considering the COVID impact, today most of the industries just are facing a bit of challenge in terms of getting the raw material right from China. This is the right time for us, each one of us, to think why this has happened and why an alternative source of vendor was not developed or could have been developed but really not utilized to that extent. The third point here would be to reassess risk ranking and modify mitigation plans. Once the risk assessment considers the new emerging business risks, I'm sure the whole risk library would undergo a significant change, and the change was also associated in terms of the corresponding ranking to the risks and the modifying the existing mitigation controls or identifying new controls as such. On to the fourth point, each risk assessment that is revised, as you all know, would also result in audit materiality, because the audit materiality, the audit procedures, the planning, the strategy, again, would depend on the nature and of the significance of the risks. The most important aspect, the next point, during a period of COVID, as it is a period of overwhelming changes, it would also be very significant and important to identify and include the fraud risk element into the whole arena of the risk assessment at an entity level. Final point, with respect to communication, a frequent, periodic, and early communication with external auditors on the impact of the risk would be really significant, because this is one area which would help them design their audit procedures on time. It would also help external auditors also appreciate the emerging risks and the mitigating controls that management identifies as a part of that. We also have come across certain examples which we would like to share with the larger group. One, as a short-term solution as such, companies have updated on a temporary basis a transactional authority to from a decentralized aspect to a more of a centralized point, just to ensure in the work from home or a new normal or COVID scenario, the transaction flow and the business doesn't get affected. However, to ensure the appropriateness, the periodic monitoring controls, be it on dollar value, be it on frequency of the transaction, be it on size of the transaction, etc., will still needs to be performed. Also, once the risks related to COVID-19 have been assessed, there is also a need to understand and assess the financial impact of COVID-19. Is it being identified, accounted, reported, and disclosed as well? Finally, as most of us are aware, not most of the manufacturing plants would have functioned 100% to their capacity levels, or they would have functioned at less than expected capacity levels. So this would have also resulted in the need for assessment of useful and residual life of property, plant, and equipment, and finally the impact of these due to the COVID 2019 as such. On to the next key focus area, which is inventory. Four key aspects to ponder upon the area of inventory as such. One, with the COVID-19, there has been a significant increase in the frequency of demand and forecast reassessment. I'd like to put an example here. While an organization would have had a process of demand and forecast ongoing on a monthly basis, but due to COVID-19 scenario, there is a need for reassessing this frequency level. 1 month might not hold good because currently the demand from both customer as well as the vendor perspective is changing very dynamically and at a very fast pace. So this would involve probably weekly, probably daily, or probably twice a week based on the organization's needs, the way they were tracking the demand in the forecast as such. Second, broken supply chain. Yes, in terms of the supply chain, the significance and impact of the supply chain needs to be estimated. While I was discussing a while back in terms of assessing the vendors' capabilities, vendors' facilities, are they able to supply the required material within the required time frame? That is something needs to be relooked and re-reviewed. On to the third point, in this would have also surely resulted in identifying certain carrying costs as well as the storage costs of the inventory due to the COVID-19 scenario as such. This is one area which management will have to again reassess and reconsider. Also, from the overhead perspective, the allocation of fixed overheads with respect to the production, which is not increased, mainly due to the low production or the idle plant as such. Again, the impact of this would have an impact on the inventory valuation as such. Finally, assessing the significance of write down, one of the key areas, because all of us know the impact of or the potential impact of write down that could be. The write down can always result due to three or more than three aspects over here. One, the reduced movement of inventory, which could have resulted in slow, obsolete, or non-moving of inventory and increasing age as such. Secondly, drop in demand or a dropping selling price of the product. And finally, obsolescence due to lower than expected sales. These are the key areas which needs to be considered and reassessed at a periodic level, and also corresponding disclosures. And management also needs to be more innovative in terms of coming out with certain. There is no one way of doing today, and each of the innovative ways can help us come out of this situation. Would like to share one practical example that we have come across recently with respect to the inventory physical count that was conducted by one of the manufacturing organization. The call that was taken by this company was that they wanted to conduct a physical inventory as of 31st March, but due to COVID-19 that could not happen, and management only conducted on 31st March of 19 without participation from internal or statutory auditors as such. So what the company has performed was that they devised a strategy or a plan to perform the physical inventory at the year end, count at a date after the year end. The way they have gone about was that the audit team has selected a sample covering the adequate coverage in terms of the value and based on certain sampling techniques. And a visual observation procedure was used here, wherein the entire physical check of the inventory was observed via video recording mode, and the video recording was saved for future references as such. To ensure, in case of any further query, one can always go back and check the recording that is available. The third key step here was that the performance of physical vis-a-vis the bookstock on a sample basis, while physical was viewed over a video, the bookstock data was always available, and to check and find if at all there are any discrepancies. Once this was done, the most significant aspect here would be to roll back the inventory balance as on the date on which the physical check was conducted to the date on which financials were reported, which is 31st March. This would be really significant because the date on which the inventory was counted, say let's take an example of the 20th of April. So the inventory as on that date will have to be tied back to 31st March with various issues and GRMs that could have been made during that time frame. And finally, the reconciliation between these two sets of periods will need to be performed, and any discrepancies will have to be reasoned out and a solution will have to be arrived at. On to the next focus area, which is around policies and contracts. This is one of the most significant area which COVID-19 had an impact, because the policies of the companies, it can be bifurcated into two. One area would be related to the internal and one is external. Internal, the way I mean employees. There would be policies related to employees, which are pay related, other benefits related, etc. And the external set of policies in terms of company having agreements with facilities, canteen, housekeeping, security, etc. So there would be a change in terms of the way the policies have been structured, because every impact of COVID-19 will have to be factored in the policy. One, either the new procedures will have to be developed or the existing procedures will have to be updated to that extent to reflect how they are going to address this new normal. The second key aspect would be to evaluate the service provider's ability as on date to see if they are able to operate as they were operating before COVID, number one. Number two, are they able to adhere to their SLAs and KPIs as agreed? If not, again, there will be an innovative way or an opportunity for the management to identify what needs to be done in such a scenario. Are we going to check out the vendor? Are we going to impose any penalty? Or are we going to have a discussion and revisit the whole agreement as such? The third point with respect to a review of certain contracts, key significant contracts in terms of the dollar value or an impact would be lease contracts and certain key contracts with the vendors and the service providers. These will have to be revisited considering the fact that post COVID-19, if most of the workforce works from home or WFA aspect has come into the picture, I'm sure every organization would be pondering in terms of what to do with so much of the office space. That is one key aspect that would be considered. The fourth aspect would be from a reclassification of debt from a long-term to current in case the debt modifications and covenants are breached. Fifth significant aspect would be in terms of identifying, having a frequent, continuous conversation with the both vendors and creditors, vendors and debtors, to understand their solvency position, because they are the key partners, business partners, with whom we have been traveling since ages, and they are the ones who are critical to the conduct of our business. So it will be very critical and significant to have a dialogue or discussion and to check on their aspect on the current solvency and also the future ability to continue with the services as such. And finally, with respect to the organization's failure to fulfill obligations on the force majeure, I'm sure most of us would have come across the clause called force majeure and its implications, etc. Would like to quote an example over here, wherein I'm sure while force majeure might not be a final solution across the contracts and between the parties, while most of us are aware with the latest economic packages that have been announced by the government, and government is trying its level best to give certain benefits to MSME sector. Let's take an example wherein what would have happened if the big players start invoking this clause against the MSME sector. One, the sector would have had a serious impact, and two, the benefit that government is trying to give this to the sector could have not been much beneficial as such. Also, we are not sure at this point of time will force majeure invocation would be a pro industry. That is a question that we need to ponder upon, and there is no yes or there is no for that particular aspect as such. Let's take an example of an auto sector. As most of us are aware, auto OEMs do develop the auto ancillary units on them, and they also coexist and co-develop each other. And what if the auto OEMs, the big shots, invoke this clause upon auto ancillary and smaller units? One, this is going to wipe out the ancillary sector as such. And also, once the pandemic is over and once we all come out of this, the time that would take to revive that particular chain would be really long. So hence, industry will have to be, or industry will have to create a cohesive environment where we understand and support each other and end up in a win-win situation rather than win-lose or lose-win situation as such. Also, from a policy standpoint, we have come across certain organizations which have already started an exercise to revamp the existing policies related to travel. As most of us are aware now, in near short term, the travel cost would be really low. And they've also started to relook at the policy of local conveyance. Again, one of the key focus areas for the management. They also started relooking at the office space agreements as such. And also interesting aspect will be to relook at the policies related to mobile and data usage. So this pandemic is going to give a total significant shift the way the risks were looked, have been looked, and will be looked in the future. And these policies might also extend to the restructuring of the employee compensation structure as such, keeping COVID-19 in the picture. On to the next focus area, which is IT access. Key things to consider here, as most of us know, IT is the backbone of our business as on date, and IT is the enabler to conduct most of the business as such. In work from home or work from anywhere scenario, there would be increased requests for the new accesses, and that is only bound to increase as and we go about in the future. Hence, the process to ensure adequate approval mechanism in line with the role and responsibility metrics needs to be in place and needs to be revisited frequently as such. Second point, ensuring even in the emergency situation, the additional accesses and the rights are given, but yes, with certain approvals and certain process that has been designed in place. I would like to give an example here. We have come across an organization which took COVID-19 as more of an opportunity than a threat. And it was really surprising. They took a significant call of migrating their ERP. They were onto an old ERP, which was not that beneficial to them in terms of be it controls, be it integration with other applications. So finally, management decided to migrate to a new one. And as most of us are aware, migration is not that an easy task. And migration has also, the way they have gone about was that the migration, a blueprint was prepared obviously to go ahead with the migration, followed by the revised process maps, followed by revised SOPs, followed by revised matrices, that is the risk control matrices, which has totally given a massive shift. The organization had been looking at the risk, and the organization would look at the risk going forward. Third example, in terms of additional user access reviews over and above the existing access will have to be carefully looked and then only approved. There is also a risk in terms of the work from home or work from anywhere environment, wherein the vulnerability of accessing our servers from home have really gone up. There could be certain phishing attacks, so other types of attacks over the servers or over an email, which will have to be reassessed and relooked from a control perspective. Also, the other important point here would be to ensure that access to internal networks is restricted only for the authorized devices. While we had in the past a concept of bring your own device, these concepts will might have to be relooked from a security perspective. So the other key aspect that would have got affected due to COVID-19 would be dealing with the data leakage, privacy aspects, data protection aspects, etc. These things will have to be looked at from a broader perspective. And final thing, holistically, when we look at the IT environment at an entity level, it will also be important. It's not only the initiative of the IT team. The users will also play a significant role in terms of the controls, and hence any change in the policy, any introduction of a new policy, or any modification of existing policy, users will have to be informed and users will have to be adequately trained according to these new policies as such. Over the next few topics, my co-speaker Sunil Rao would take them forward, and I would like to introduce Sunil at this point of time. Sunil leads the SOX practice nationally for productivity and has about 15 years of consulting experience in multiple domains, including internal audits, SOX, IFCs, and operational consulting in energy and utility sectors. And Sunil has been a speaker on risk management related topics across various professional forums in the past. Over to you, Sunil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lakshman. And I'm sorry for the technical glitch. So, Lakshman, just let me know in case I'm not audible.
Yeah, sure.
So, going forward for the documentation and risk and controls, I'd like to actually get started with a very important discussion which we were having with certain entities who file their SOX in an accelerated filing mode in the US. Now, with that said, there were discussions which were around the samples, and there were also discussions around how do we select the samples on the typical scenario where there's a lockdown. So there were certain aspects which were discussed that during the typical lockdown scenario where the operations would be impacted, these are the times where the possibly samples can be broken down into the operational and the non-operational mode. So that's the way you can possibly classify and start looking at it. The businesses world across would have these disruptions, and to ensure that the selections and the testings actually happen in an appropriate manner, it would be best to actually consider some of these aspects. Apart from this, it will be important to reassess or get started with the documentations and the control testing early, so that the appropriate remediation plans can be called for as well. So those are certain things which, as you get started with the internal controls under the IFC or under the SOX environments, which you can start thinking about, there may not be a specific guidance with regard to this, but taking the stat auditors, the management auditors, and the managements, having a discussion around it, the appropriate samples and procedures can be discussed and documented. that gets me on to the next point, which talks about things which Lakshman had covered briefly around the policies and the procedures. There could be a need where certain controls or certain procedures would have to be temporarily tweaked. Now, when I say temporarily tweaked, it is basically a situational requirement. Let us, for example, take that. So, for the first quarter, we're having a disruption, and we're talking about a typical HR related control where an employee has exited the organization and needs to hand over his assets, laptops, and other assets of the organization, which would have otherwise happened in an in person physical basis. Now, in the revised scenarios, we would need possibly approvals to have happened, and then these handovers can happen later. But then the documentation with regard to that and towards that is something which the auditors and which the management would have to ensure that they take these documentations well in advance to ensure there is no deviation from the control temporarily, and then can get back to it in terms of a post-lockdown scenario or maybe post-resumption scenario where they would possibly have to break it up and then accordingly revisit the temporary approvals which have been provided. So there are changes which would have to be called for from a documentation perspective in the risks and controls as well. Let me give you also another example, typically of a hospitality client. Now, for one of the hospitality clients, we have seen that there is absolutely no revenue which is actually happening because nobody would come and stay right now. At this point of time, it's almost a shutdown mode. With that said, it is very, very difficult for them to tomorrow when we come back and start testing their controls and looking at it and say whether a particular category of room has been provided as per the rate card or an agreed rate card and why this particular rate card has not been followed. I think those entire set of controls will possibly have to be changed, or I would say not tested. To that extent, there would be a need for calling for a controls rationalization slash relook. Some controls may have to be dropped and some controls may have to be reconsidered. So the same example of the hospitality client where potentially the rooms would have been given for a quarantine facility would then be possibly calling a different conversation, whether it is being given as part of their CSR activity or whether that is being given as part of a very limited payment kind of an activity, at least to keep the operations happening. So the changes which would happen, one has to consider that the regular documentations like the risk and controls and others would possibly need to be revisited. All these could also be industry and sector specific, and that's how it could possibly be considered. Now, with that said, I think it's also important to focus on one of the other very important things is the occupational health and safety and the environmental health and safety. Now, this is something which has always been there. There's nothing new about it. But in terms of the way the organizations could look on this in future would need additional attention. So there could be conversations around having these safety audits, which include hygiene, be covered more thoroughly, and there could be robust risk and controls which are designed for these and considered on a maybe quarterly or a half yearly basis, or possibly have only those who have been certified by certain norms and standards to be part of the hygiene, either canteens or crush or various other places, including transportation and logistics. Those kind of organization, those kind of industries would have to take the extra caution and have these kind of controls also built in. Lot will depend on the maturity of the organization as well. In addition to it is the availability of resources and the amount they can spend in. So with that said, I'll get on to my next part of the conversation. If I can request for the next slide, please. So this part of it, we just briefly speak about a particular survey, which is of very great interest to us. In the recent times, you've seen this, that a lot of phishing emails keep happening in terms of a general check. Lakshman briefly spoke about in the IT part of the conversation about enhanced fraud related controls to be relooked at. I'll give you a simple example. In one of the surveys we have run and seen recently, the number of participants or the number of responses, which ideally would have been 8% for emails which should have never been responded or attended to. So these phishing emails had 32% response rate. What that calls for is actually a thought that people may be looking at their emails sitting on a work from home or a work from anywhere kind of a concept, and they have the additional time to start responding to emails. And that's the reason they have done that. But which also calls for is an enhanced level and a refocus on the kind of training sessions which organizations are conducting or may need to conduct. Considering the COVID scenario, there could be a relook at the entire training programs itself of what need to be realigned to the organizational's learnings which they have had in the past 10 weeks. So cyber safety and hygiene could possibly have a relook from a training perspective, because these are things which of late all the support systems, whether it is IT, HR, have been stressed by most of the organizations to ensure that their BCP is up and running. While in addition to the vulnerability assessments and seeing whether the firewall logs and rule books are being observed and scrutinized properly, some of these aspects also would come in handy. And then I think the entire audit program or the plan for the year has to be revised considering these cybersecurity aspects and the IT aspects, considering them in view, including the PHIs and the PIIs, taking the permissions, having a look at the existing contracts with the various clients, whether the contracts permit working through a dynamic IP or a static IP, whether they require a pre-approval. How have we done that so that knowingly, unknowingly, there has been absolutely no breach of any contract? So with that said, I'll get on to the next conversation. So this is one of the most deliberated topics of late which have happened, and this is something which I think is not new to anyone. The non-availability of certain key people. It could be the succession planning which has possibly not kicked in properly. It could be non-availability of IT infrastructure. It could be access. It could be anything with regard to the work to go on. The segregation of duty or the delegation of authority may have potentially taken change in the current scenario. With that said, I think it is extremely important for organizations to not completely, I would say, alienate from this, but start considering that whether this is a temporary change or whether this would call for a more permanent change, whether this is something which has to happen on an immediate basis and can be regularized later, or is this something which needs to continue even at a longer period of time. All these aspects will have a direct and indirect impact on the controls which are being tested in a typical IFC and a SOX environment, and also for various processes from the cradle to grave, the accounts payable process, and whether the approvals have happened appropriately and whether it's been documented properly. The MRC related controls in a typical SOX environment, how are we actually documenting and ensuring that these temporary phases are appropriately documented to the satisfaction of the statutory auditors. So these are aspects which would definitely come into play. Also would be very important to understand the fact that small and medium enterprises and the medium enterprises would potentially not have the wherewithal or would not potentially have the resources to always consider, even under a typical normal scenario, to have too many people to actually have the maker checker concepts and others in place. And in the current scenario, it would be even more compromised, or could be potentially getting into a, I would say, a red zone where there could potentially be a failure. These are something which are extremely important to be addressed upon right in the beginning. And as the financial year just kicked in for most of the companies in India, we're 2 months into it. But I think these are things which need immediate attention from a documentation standpoint of view, to ensure that there are no last minute surprises and questions don't come up from the board's angle. Can I request for the next slide, please? Could we go on to the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. So on the accounting aspects, I know we have spoken and heard a lot amongst the various other seminars and webinars as well on the investments, impairments, relooking at the loans, write downs. Lakshman covered inventory aspect as well. I would like to bring about 2-3 things here in addition to the going concern. It's extremely important for us to understand that while the basic accounting conventions and concepts on going concerns get questioned sometimes in adverse scenarios like this, but it's also important to actually start looking at it from a typical organizational behavior and cultural change or strategic changes and how fast they have possibly been able to look into it. Let me give you two simple examples here, and these have been real examples for some of the clients we've been dealing in. One of the clients has actually come back and mentioned that there is a huge amount of reduction in the motor claims. When I say motor claims, that's because, and this incident has happened in Europe, that a lot of people are in the lockdown not driving cars and hence not having accidents and banging their cars on the road. So the motor claims have been almost nil. However, the claims with regard to the depression, mental illness, and actually the deaths on account of COVID have taken a steep increase. That calls for a discussion on the estimates and other aspects for each product line of insurance to be considered and reconsidered in an appropriate way using the existing scenario as a basis. Also, it's important to understand that certain other companies, which potentially, I'm talking about a particular garment apparel manufacturer who's been innovative because of a forced change to change their product line from a regular manufacturing of an apparel to a movement towards a protective personal equipment, the PPE, which the government has subscribed to. These changes have been all of a sudden mandated or basically to continue its existing operations or to use its idle assets. Either of these combinations technically may have surfaced as a conversation which would have started that will this organization survive? But how quickly they have adapted themselves and have impacts accordingly have to also be considered, calling for changes in their existing processes, calling for changes in the forecast, calling for changes in the estimates from the accounting language. Also, there are a lot of conversations which are ongoing with various stimulus packages which are being announced across the countries, including India, for various sectors, for various subsidies, deferments, moratoriums, and others which are calling for. All of them, from the government perspective, from the industry perspective, and from the people perspective, would call for certain action. From a company's perspective, it would be how would you want to consider this and what are the accounting entries and impacts coming in, whether the recording of it is actual absolute certainty or is it going to really happen or not. All these are aspects which one has to consider, which gets me to the last point of the conversation, which is around a very rich literature which may be required to be discussed and presented in the management discussion and analysis of the annual reports or to the stakeholders or a typical notes to the accounts or significant accounting literature which has to be given in. Adequate care and caution has to be taken because of this novel impact which has had in this particular financial year for most of the companies and how they would want to actually classify these and give a reassurance on how the management has tweaked or addressed certain aspects and certain other important concerns. So with that said, I think we would take a pause here and would be happy to address any specific questions which may have been addressed to any one of us, please.
Sir, we have some question. I am trying to give the mic so they can directly ask.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Can you explain this once again at the end, this rollback inventory balance to year-end reporting date, and how would it help?
Yeah. Sure, Ranjana. Thank you. Sunil, probably I'll take this up and you can add it later.
Sure. Go ahead, Lakshman.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So the way presume a scenario wherein the sample-based check was conducted on say 20th of April or date, and the book versus physical on 20th of April was matching, and say it was 150. Okay. And way back as on 31st of March, maybe the stock as per the books was 100. So between these two dates, there could have been transactions of both receipts as well as issues, that is in and out, right?
Yeah.
So arithmetically, you travel back from 150 to 100 by way of analyzing the GRN and the issues dump and see if this number was really 100 as per the computation on that date or not, and draw a comfort. While is this a comfort a stat auditor would like to draw? I'm not sure on this particular point, but in the scenario which we have gone through, yes, this exercise was accepted.
Ashish, you can ask your question.
Yeah, so good evening, sir. My question is basically, I've been auditing projects and construction. So in the current situation, and understanding the construction industry requirement that lot of data and records are maintained in the hard copies, and in this situation, we're not able to travel to the site basically. So how what will be the way forward and guidance on this? To carry out the audits which are extensively document based, and these are required to be carried out remotely now.
So, Lakshman, if you would want to take it up, otherwise you could possibly add post what I have to contribute.
Sure, probably you can go ahead and then I'll add some. Yeah.
Sure, great. So I think it's a very good question, and this is a very pertinent question which you have asked to not only your industry, but major infrastructure industries would possibly go through the same thing. Now, with that said, I will look at it into two ways. One is immediate, one is a longer term. The longer term, as they speak for, is in case in the IT projects, you may slowly start considering if there is a possibility to have a digital kind of a solution, because this kind of a situation has got everybody by surprise. Well, some can afford it, some can't afford it, but in the longer run, mostly the internal audit and mostly the certain other aspects could be covered at least to a lot of percentage on a digital basis. So it's time to start thinking that if another such incident happens, things can't really wait that the papers are in a physical form. With that said, I definitely understand that there will be a need for you to defer certain audits and also have certain conversations with your leadership right in the beginning to cover it at a later point of time, or potentially start having, as Lakshman had mentioned about, inventory could get covered in a very remote basis in a very different way in which they had actually experienced and actually covered it. So we would have to come up with investments or digital way is one thing. Second part of it is deferment of audits, which will be a definitive known deferment, would be the other aspect of it, which is also going to come in.
Okay, okay. Yeah, thanks. I think
Chanchal, are there any specific
Yes, sir,
questions?
some participants is asking for the presentation. So
Yeah.
I think
So
the
there,
PDF copy of this could be shared, Sunil.
correct. Yeah, it is going to be hosted, Chanchal, in our regular IA website placeholder, wherever we have normally kept the previous presentation as well. So please direct all the participants that it will be hosted there.
okay, sir. So I'm just giving a mic to participants
Yes,
who have
please.
some question.
Sure.
Yeah, so I have one question. Currently, I'm auditing a jewelry company basically, and we were having turnover of around 1,000 crore a year and an inventory of currently 2,000 crore. Now, because of this COVID and in the last 3 months, we are unable to sell anything. I mean, for this 2 months. So, will there be a jump? I mean, will there be a additional percentage of provision which we need to take? And have you got any idea? What would be the excess percentage which we can take?
Okay, if I understand the question correctly, this is with respect to the provision on the inventory, non-moving inventory or a slow-moving inventory, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So one, it depends. Sunil, probably I can answer and then you can add upon on this.
Go ahead, Lakshman.
And one, it would depend typically on the nature of the commodity, nature of the goods. It's we need to take into consideration its value, its perishable, the non-perishable, and what is the time frame. Does it have an expiry or not? And then what is its demand in the market? Is it going up, going down? A lot of factors needs to be considered. Number one. Number two, in case the company has got an existing documented policy around making a provision, that needs to be relooked and reassessed. And third aspect, if it meets above two criteria, yes, the provision will have to be created in the books of accounts based on the result of this criteria. So it can't be just a percentage driven. A lot of factors needs to be considered before creating a provision. the demand of the product, the drop in selling price, the obsolescence of the product. These are the various aspects that needs to be considered before creating a provision or before finalizing to create a provision.
Thanks, Lakshman. Chanchal, would you see any other questions coming in?
Yes, sir. We have some questions. So
Go ahead, please.
Santosh asked how a company perceive due diligence in current scenario for joint venture.
Sunil, probably
the question is how does a company perceive a due diligence in the current scenario? So, Santosh, if I may ask you, are you saying that a due diligence to be considered in a current scenario for a potential takeover? Is that what you're alluding to?
Sir, I'm just trying to give the mic. Yes, he's saying yes.
Okay, so that's going to be a very challenging thing, honestly, Santosh, because the way I look at it is uh, there are two aspects to it. One is the availability of information, documentation, availability of records, and doing the regular activity, which is deliberated based on, say, the books and the other aspects, which is available physically. Assuming that that gets deferred a little and still is available, but what would be quite challenging to see is the systems and the existing systems in the companies and how this particular sector has got very badly or positively impacted. Some sectors have got positively impacted as well. So it really depends on the nature of the company and the sector they're in. Pre-COVID, there could be, let us look at simple example of anything which has got to do with tourism, travel, hotels, and anything which has got to do. These sectors are one where the pre-COVID and the post-COVID would have two completely different answers. Whether they're going to continue, answer is definitely yes. But whether the new normal for them is going to be substantially different, answer could still be a yes. But if the sectors are completely different, I think it calls for more time to be given into this and then attended to, because a due diligence and conversations around this cannot be closed in a hurry and cannot be forced with a particular timeline.
I think very right, Sunil. It needs to be looked from a sector perspective, and considering the current scenario, something like hospitality, as Sunil rightly said a while back, that is a sector which is probably not doing really great now. So it needs to be based on a sector to sector call.
Thanks, Lakshman. Chanchal, could you please go ahead with the next question, if any, please?
Yes, sir.
We
I'm
could
just
potentially take another two
giving
questions.
mic to Abhishek Gupta. He's asking some question. So Abhishek, you can ask your question. Abhishek, you can ask your question. I have given you mic. Abhishek, can you hear us?
Chanchal, I'm not able to hear Abhishek. Maybe we can.
Yeah, we are not able to hear.
The next question, please.
Yes, sir. I'm just trying to read out. It's a long question. So disabling a removals device will definitely decrease risk, but it also restricts working environment of employee who may be dealing with pressure of work from home with limited resources. A control is required, but restricting his working space should be the last thing employee has to deal with. Your views?
Sorry, very sorry, Chanchal. Is there a way, Lakshman, can you take up that question? I couldn't really comprehend the question.
Even I couldn't
Could
really
you
comprehend.
pass on the mic, please?
Yes, sir. I'm just trying.
Okay.
Sunil, I think there seems to be some connectivity issue.
Abhishek, you can ask your question. I have given 2 time mics, but he is unable to.
Would it be possible if we can answer it over a mail or something?
Okay, sure.
Yes, sir, we can answer.
Maybe we can look into that mode.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
I think we are up for time. Yeah.
Sure. Maybe one last
okay, sir.
question is
So,
what we can factor in.
yeah, I'm just reading out
Okay.
one question from Vision, Mr. Vision. Liquidity challenges are one of the major challenges. How can we address?
So there again, Bijan, I think that again calls for multiple things. I think I really would want the respective governments to pitch in a little more depending on how badly the sector has been impacted. It's not easy for governments to address and run all sectors and all companies, but certainly some kind of a very, very high impacted sectors would call in for certain extra attention because the ability to, I would not say arm twist, but the ability to negotiate with the bankers and the financial institutions in form of moratoriums, extended moratoriums can only go so far. I think this requires an entire value chain of starting from the vendor across the supply chain, across the entire vendor to say finally the collector, the consumer to actually make certain compromises. So I think this is going to be a liquidity crisis for not just any one sector, but across the value chain, which will drop in and have various impacts. So this requires a larger deliberation, honestly, while it could be sector specific, but this requires a larger deliberation, including, I would say, in this extraordinary circumstance, even potentially involvements with the government.
Yeah, I think it's rightly said. It's the entire value chain that needs to be looked at. Yeah.
Chanchal and Chanchal, I think we are good, and thank you so much for everybody to spend this quality time. And then it's been very nice to address all of you, and we look forward for more such sessions. Thank you, Lakshman. It's been a privilege to be partnering along with you. And any closing comments from you, please?
Yeah. Firstly, thanks Sunil for your excellent support, and also thanks to Chanchal and IEA India team for their relentless support in terms of logistics and helping us through this whole webcast as
Absolutely.
such. And thanks to each one of our attendees and participants who have spent 1 hour of their valuable time over the weekend with us. Thanks so much. And on behalf of IA Hyderabad chapter, we would like to thank every participant, IA India, for all their extended support on these webinars. And we also look forward to conduct more seminars in the near future. We also like to thank our IA Hyderabad BOG and IA Hyderabad chapter members for the continuous support that we receive. Thank you so much and have a great weekend. Stay safe and stay home as well. Bye. Over to you, Chanchal.
Thanks, everyone. If you have some question which was not addressed, you can send me. I will ask to our speakers and we'll share you. My email ID is coordination@iindia.org.
Thank you.